June 5th, 2020, 5 a.m. A call comes into the emergency dispatch center in Hanahan, South Carolina. On the line is 37-year-old Matthew Speck. His voice is shaky, breathing heavy. He tells the dispatcher that two intruders broke into his home in the upscale Eagle Landing neighborhood. According to Matthew, they attacked him and his wife while they were asleep. He claims he's been hurt. When patrol units arrive, dawn hasn't yet broken. The area is still cloaked in darkness. Officers secure the perimeter. The front doors are locked. The windows are intact. There are no obvious signs of forced entry. Inside the house, everything seems untouched until they reach the second floor. In one of the bedrooms, officers discover 33-year-old Caitlin Speck lying on the bed. She's unresponsive. At the foot of the bed, on a rug she often napped on, is the family's golden Labrador, Bailey May. She's also gone. Matthew greets officers with blood on his clothes. There are fresh cuts on his forearms and stomach. He tells detectives he was wounded in a struggle with the alleged attackers, who, according to him, fled just moments before the sound of approaching sirens. As investigators comb through the home, they start to notice things that don't quite add up. Wallets, electronics, and jewelry remain untouched. Nothing's been ransacked. No drawers opened. No signs of a frantic search for valuables. The house is neat, except for the bedroom where the tragedy unfolded. To understand what really happened that morning, we have to go back 12 years. This story began in 2008 when Caitlin Conran met Matthew Speck at a community event. Caitlin, born August 18, 1986, was working from home as a designer at the time of the 2020 incident. Her career allowed her to spend most of her time in Hanahan, in a two-story house nestled in the quiet streets of Eagle Landing. Her constant daytime companion was Bailey May, the golden lab she considered a true member of the family. Matthew Speck, who was 37 at the time of the incident, had been living with Caitlin since early in their relationship. Those who knew the couple described their life as steady. They owned property, invested in home improvement, and never aired personal issues in public. Caitlin had been planning a major home renovation. She often chatted with friends about interior ideas and spent time picking out design materials. She frequently said how much she enjoyed the peacefulness of suburban life and the freedom to work comfortably from home. Behind what seemed like a stable and happy home, close friends of Caitlin had begun to notice a troubling shift in Matthew's behavior. In the final years of their marriage, Caitlin confided in her inner circle about a growing emotional distance. According to her, Matthew was spending more time away from home and had become noticeably cold in their conversations. Still, Caitlin kept pouring energy and money into the house and into the life they had built. She wasn't seeking a separation. She hadn't looked for a new place to live. Everything inside the Eagle Landing home remained unchanged. Her design sketches were still laid out on the table, building supplies were stacked neatly in the garage, and her daily routine continued to revolve around Bailey May's care. This was Caitlin's safe space, her sanctuary. What she didn't know was that the rhythm of her life had already become the subject of calculated planning by the very person she shared that home and bed with. While medics tended to Matthew Speck's injuries, forensic teams got to work on the technical analysis of the Hanahan property. The investigators' first priority was to figure out how the alleged intruders had gotten in. But something didn't sit right. The perimeter showed no sign of forced entry. Every single access point was locked tight. The front door was secured with a deadbolt and an internal latch. All windows, upstairs and down, were unbroken. The frames were tightly sealed, and the mesh screens were intact, with no slits or pressure marks. Inside, the scene told a story that clashed with Matthew's version of events. In the foyer, Caitlin's wallet was sitting undisturbed on a side table, with cash and credit cards still inside. In the living room, expensive laptops and other electronics were right where anyone would expect to find them. Not a single drawer had been pulled open. Clothes in the closet were untouched. On the kitchen floor and in the hallways, there were no footprints, no streaks of dirt. No evidence that someone had stormed through in a hurry or that a scuffle had taken place involving more than one person. The bedroom where Caitlin had been found was a sealed-off space. According to Matthew's account, 2 men had burst into the room, fired shots, wounded him, and fled. But the forensic breakdown told a different story. For anyone to have exited the house, they would have had to relock the deadbolt and latch from the inside, an impossible move unless they were still in the house or had keys. Investigators found no sign of lockpicks or spare keys being used. The entire structure of the scene, the mechanics of the doors and windows, pointed to one undeniable fact. When the shots were fired, the only living beings inside that home were Caitlin, Matthew, and the dog. The concept of a break-in started to fall apart. There were no exit paths, no signs of movement beyond that room. That night, the spec home in Eagle Landing had effectively become an airtight capsule, one that no one had left until law enforcement arrived. At the hospital where Matthew's spec was taken, doctors and on-call detectives began a thorough examination of his injuries. Matthew claimed he sustained the wounds during a violent struggle with armed intruders. But forensic specialists came to a different conclusion after closely analyzing the cuts on his arms and torso. The wounds were shallow, with smooth edges, nothing like the jagged or torn lacerations typically seen when someone is fighting off wild knife strikes. There were no signs of defensive wounds, no deep gashes on the palms or backs of the hands, which usually appear when someone tries to grab a blade or shield their face. The experts labeled the injuries as classic self-inflicted or hesitation marks. The placement of the cuts on the forearms and front of the abdomen were in areas easily reachable by the person himself. On top of that, the bloodstains on Matthew's clothing suggested he had been standing still when the injuries occurred. In a real attack, with movement and struggle, the blood pattern would have been completely different. Sprays, smears, chaotic distribution. But what they found was clean, consistent, and controlled. Detectives also took note of Matthew's odd behavior during evidence collection. His story about the alleged intruders kept changing. He couldn't keep the descriptions of their height or clothing straight. What stayed consistent, though, was his focus on his own pain. Medical reports confirmed that none of his wounds were life-threatening or required advanced surgical treatment. In fact, they were neat, almost surgical incisions made at deliberate angles. Investigators compared this with what they saw at the scene. Spotless floors, no signs of a physical altercation, and only minor scratches on the one surviving person in the house. The image of a brave fight for survival fell apart under the trained eyes of forensic experts. The second body found in the upstairs bedroom belonged to the family's golden Labrador, Bailey May. For detectives, the loss of the dog became a critical piece of the puzzle in understanding the suspect's logic. Ballistics confirmed that Bailey May had been shot with the same weapon used on Caitlin Speck. The angle of the bullet suggested the shot was fired at close range. The dog was lying in her usual spot by the bed. Her position indicated she hadn't tried to attack or flee. She never saw it coming. The behavior of the family's Labrador that night became a critical point against the theory of an outside intruder. Neighbors in the Eagle Landing community later confirmed that Bailey May had always been vocal around strangers, barking whenever someone unfamiliar came near the gate or stepped into the hallway. But around 5 a.m. that morning, no one in the neighborhood reported hearing a single bark until the gunshots. This suggested that whoever moved through the house and entered the bedroom was someone the dog recognized. Someone she didn't see as a threat until it was too late. Investigators asked a key question. Why would robbers, supposedly after money, waste time and bullets on a pet that posed no real danger? In the context of a staged scene, the shooting of the dog looked more like an attempt to eliminate any variable that could disrupt the silence or trigger unwanted attention. In his initial statement, Matthew Speck claimed the intruders killed Bailey May just because. But the logic didn't hold. The forensic team believed it was a calculated move, an intentional act by someone who knew the dog well enough to realize she could betray him with her reaction or ruin the illusion of a break-in. Even in death, Bailey May pointed investigators toward a chilling truth. Whoever pulled the trigger was someone from inside her world. The bullet that ended her life became just as vital a piece of evidence as the shell casing found beside Caitlin's body. While Matthew Speck remained under medical observation, tech experts finished extracting data from his personal digital devices. His phone and computer, both seized from the Eagle Landing home, became a kind of black box, capturing the suspect's every move in the days leading up to the event. According to the cyber forensics report, Matthew's online activity took a dark and specific turn in the days before the shooting. His browser history showed dozens of visits to pages related to toxicology and techniques for staging criminal scenes. Analysts confirmed that he wasn't just skimming articles. He had spent hours on specialized forums, reading detailed discussions and gathering information. On his phone, screenshots were found showing maps with potential exit routes from the neighborhood, routes that could theoretically be used by someone trying to flee undetected. What stood out most to detectives was the timing. These online searches were happening late at night while Caitlin was still in the next room. The existence of this kind of digital footprint on the phone of someone claiming a sudden home invasion became a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. But what truly unraveled Matthew's story wasn't just what he searched, it was when. The timestamps on his activity directly contradicted his claims of a happy, committed marriage. To determine a motive, investigators broke the case down into two key areas: Matthew's personal relationships and his financial expectations. The most revealing testimony came from an ex-girlfriend, someone Matthew had reconnected with a few months before, June 2020. She provided messages in which Matthew plainly stated that his current marriage was nothing more than a formality he intended to take care of soon, so he could start a new life with her. The second branch of the investigation led detectives to one of Matthew Speck's co-workers. While his former girlfriend saw him as a romantic soul longing for freedom, his colleague painted a very different picture, one of a calculated and pragmatic man. According to her, Matthew rarely complained about Caitlin as a person. What really frustrated him were the legal complications around dividing assets. He repeatedly emphasized that Caitlin would never agree to sell their home in Hanahan. For Matthew, a legal divorce meant losing the property he valued most and facing years of financial obligation. The co-worker confirmed to investigators that Matthew had asked her what typically happens to shared real estate in the event of a spouse's unexpected passing. Suddenly, the pieces fell into place. Removing Caitlin would allow Matthew to keep the house, start a new life with someone else, and avoid the financial downfall a divorce would bring. It was the classic struggle between wanting a clean slate and refusing to pay the legal price for it. Just hours after being discharged from the hospital, Matthew Speck found himself in the interrogation room. Detectives used a strategy known as logic traps. When Matthew once again claimed that he had chased the intruders down the hallway all the way to the door, one detective asked the crucial question, "Matthew, if you chased them, how did responding officers find the front door locked from the inside? And why was there no damage to any of the windows?" Matthew had no real answer. He stumbled over his own timeline, first suggesting he might have locked the door himself in a state of shock, then wavering into bizarre territory, calling the intruders phantoms. Then detectives presented the forensic report on his wounds, the shallow nature of the cuts, and the complete lack of gunpowder residue on his clothing, something you'd absolutely expect if someone had fought a shooter at close range, completely shattered his story. But the final blow came with the printouts from Chapter 6. Detectives read his own search history aloud to him: how to fake a robbery, lethal dose of cyanide. Matthew Speck went silent. The room fell into an uneasy stillness, a kind of unspoken admission. The airtight home, the surgical cuts, the disturbingly detailed browser history. There was no more room for talk of mysterious strangers. Matthew Speck was placed under arrest. He never offered a real explanation for why his online searches mirrored the crime scene so precisely. Drawing from ballistic testing, blood spatter analysis, and digital evidence, investigators reconstructed the timeline of what really happened that night. The events didn't begin at 5 a.m., as Matthew had claimed. They began much earlier, in the darkness of the Eagle Landing neighborhood. Matthew waited until Caitlin was sound asleep. He retrieved the weapon, one he had prepped and loaded ahead of time. At that moment, the only ones inside the home were Caitlin, Matthew, and their Labrador, Bailey May. The first shots were fired in the upstairs bedroom. Caitlin was still in bed. She never had a chance to react. She made no defensive movements. Immediately after that, Matthew turned the weapon on Bailey May. The dog, who had shown no aggression toward her owner, was taken down where she lay. With the only living beings in the house now gone, Matthew Speck moved on to execute the plan he'd studied online. He walked from room to room, carefully staging what he wanted to look like a break-in. But even in this performance, he was selective, avoiding damage to valuable electronics and the home's interior, which he clearly intended to keep. Once he finished setting the scene, Matthew went into the bathroom. Using a sharp object, presumably a knife later found bearing his DNA, he inflicted a series of shallow cuts on his arms and abdomen. He did this in front of a mirror, carefully controlling the depth of each wound to avoid hitting any major arteries. Only after making sure he looked the part of a victim and waiting until daylight began to creep into the neighborhood did Matthew finally pick up his phone and call emergency services. The entire process, from the first shot to the call, took considerable time, which explained why blood on both Caitlin and the dog had already started to dry by the time medical personnel arrived. Every action Matthew Speck took that night was calculated, aimed at building the illusion of an outside attack, all while keeping himself safe behind locked doors. In November 2024, the trial began in Berkeley County Court. Prosecutor Alexander Myers approached the case like a math problem, precise, structured, and undeniable. Instead of lengthy opening statements, he let the technical experts speak. A forensic pathologist demonstrated why Matthew's wounds couldn't have happened during a struggle. "These aren't marks from chaos," he told the jury. "These are signs of planning." Ballistics experts backed it up with scientific clarity. The angle of the bullets in the bedroom showed the shooter had been standing still, firing at targets who weren't moving. The shell casings found next to Caitlin and beside Bailey May matched exactly. The prosecutor emphasized that the person who fired those shots wasn't rushed. He operated in a sealed, empty home, fully aware no one would interrupt him. That same day, testimony from Matthew's co-worker and former girlfriend cemented the prosecution's case. Both the financial motive and emotional intent were laid bare. The defense attempted to cast doubt by pointing to the poor quality of nearby security cameras, arguing that no footage proved there weren't intruders. But that point only strengthened the state's position. No one had entered or exited the home that night. After 5 days of intense testimony, the trial neared its conclusion. On the final day, the jury was reminded of the glaring contradiction at the heart of Matthew's story. His tale of chasing attackers through a house that was physically locked from the inside. Deliberations didn't take long. For those who had seen the crime scene photos and the search history on Matthew's phone, the truth was crystal clear. When everyone returned to the courtroom, the silence was almost physical. Judge Deidre Jefferson accepted the verdict form from the jury foreperson. Matthew Garrett Speck was found guilty on all counts: premeditated homicide, cruelty toward an animal, and unlawful use of a firearm. Caitlin's mother and sister, seated quietly in the gallery, received the verdict through silent tears. It wasn't a surprise, but it was the official confirmation that the man they had once welcomed as family was, in the end, her executioner. The jury agreed. From the first internet search to the final call to emergency services, every step Matthew Speck took had been part of a calculated and cold-blooded plan. The final chapter of the Berkeley County case came with sentencing. Judge Jefferson didn't soften her language. Matthew Speck was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. An additional 10 years were added, making it legally impossible for him to pursue early release based on good behavior under South Carolina law. The court emphasized that Speck hadn't just committed a crime, he had tried to manipulate the justice system by staging a false attack. That level of cold precision was a decisive factor in handing down the maximum sentence. As of now, Matthew Speck is serving his term in a South Carolina correctional facility, designated as without possibility of release. The fate of the Eagle Landing home, the silent motive behind the crime, was also sealed. Under state law, a person cannot benefit from their own offense. The property was transferred to Caitlin's heirs. This case will remain in the Hanahan archives as a chilling reminder that in the digital age of forensics, perfect cover-ups don't exist. Caitlin Speck and Bailey May are now at peace, and their story reached an end guided by facts that couldn't be locked behind any door.